Abraham today, which is the first one that starts to feel like maybe it could actually just be history rather than some sort of metaphorical parable or something along those lines. In terms of timescale, as I understand it, it's generally regarded that Abraham was around about 4,000 years ago. So interestingly, this is actually after the time of the Pyramid of Giza was built. As I understand, that was supposed to have been around about 2,500 BC. I can't even quite put my finger on why I feel like this is a change in tone, whereas all the others feel a bit sort of mystical and mythical, I suppose. This just reads almost like a story of some fairly ordinary dude who went and did some stuff. It's not a particularly coherent story, I guess, in many ways. It's just he seems to just spend the whole time just moving around and doing stuff, and he's clearly a fairly normal, flawed human being. There are some miraculous elements, I suppose, but nothing like what we've encountered in the earlier stories. It's interesting. I don't know where I've got it from, but I've got in mind that there's talk about Abraham's God is the same as the God of Christianity, of Judaism and of Islam. I don't know if that means that those other two track back to only this point and reject all the rest that goes before Adam and Eve, but it's Abraham is clearly a very significant figure in all three of those religions. And that does tie in with the story feeling a little bit like, okay, we've set the tone in terms of some parables to illustrate what we're up against here. Now it's actually just seems like God's trying to get a dude to go and do stuff and move the whole thing forward. Not going to lie though, it gets a bit weird. Clearly it seems almost not meaningfully weird. It seems more like it's a sort of weird where it's just, well, that sounds almost true because, you know, when people say you couldn't make that up, it's almost like, why would you make up some of this stuff? But we'll see. The story of Abraham in the middle is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which I had heard of, but I didn't particularly understand what it was or anything. It's only very vaguely related to Abraham. So for this one, I'm just going to go from Abraham right through until his death. And then in the next video, I'll come back and look individually at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which gets really weird. Like a whole new level of really, really weird. So in the short version of the story of Abraham, I think he's about 75 years old, and God comes along and says, right, leave here, go out, and I want you to go to this special place. A little odd. I'm going to make you the father of nations, so you're going to have bajillions of kids. Abraham seems to think this is an odd thing, whereas not so long ago in the Bible, everyone would be, perfectly normal having kids at 500 years old. But Abraham's thinking it's a bit weird at 75, so it's clearly continuing that shift in terms of people's longevity is reducing substantially. It's not really sort of a Lord of the Rings type journey or anything. It says in the Bible, God says go there, and Abraham does, and it's kind of done. He's there. It does seem, however, that it's a very big area because throughout he's moving every 5 minutes. He's moving to a different part of this region that he's been sent to. They get to Abraham and his followers. They all get to this area anyway, and it's all have a look about, and then suddenly there's a famine, so they leave that area anyway and go to Egypt. In Egypt, odd enough, Abraham is worried because apparently his wife is really hot, and he thinks people are going to see her and then kill him to get her. So he says to his wife, "Let's pretend you're my sister." Turns out later on she is his half sister, but okay, we'll leave that alone. And sure enough, the Pharaoh takes a shine to Abraham's wife Sarah, or I should say they're Abram and Sarah at this point. God later changes their names, but I'm not sure that particularly matters. So the Pharaoh takes a liking to Abraham's wife, makes her one of his concubines by the sounds of it, and then Abraham seems to gain lots of riches because his sister is one of the concubines of the Pharaoh. God, it turns out, doesn't like this. Abraham said the lie to try and make sure he wasn't killed, but God doesn't approve at all, so he makes the Pharaoh sick, and then the Pharaoh finds out, and he comes to Abraham and, "What are you doing? It's your sister and it's your wife," and it's all weird and messed up. Weirder still, though, is that the Pharaoh gives Abraham's wife back, gives him loads of money, well, what passes for money in those days, cattle and all the rest of it. And Abraham goes off, quite a rich man for his time in Egypt. It's a very odd one. I mean, the only relevance of the story almost seems to be that, well, perhaps also to illustrate that Abraham's a somewhat flawed man and that he goes around telling people his wife is his sister to go and get money. It's difficult to tell if that's exactly what happened, but that's the result anyway. And I don't know if it's actually particularly relevant, but Abraham ends up a rich man. So is the relevance just that we're illustrating that Abraham had a lot of money? Anyway, Abraham's getting older. There's still no kids. God's still saying that you're going to have so many kids that you're going to have more than stars in the sky or dust on the ground, and which sounds like bajillions. God gives a blessing to Sarah, so she starts yielding children well. So it's like a baby factory, and it does sound like Abraham is having kids with other people as well, and it's just babies popping out everywhere. A little bit weird, but I suppose at this point God's wiped out the population of the world 400 years ago, I guess, was it, for Noah? So there can't be that many people. So there does seem to be an emphasis on the being fruitful, as it's put, which seems to just be about going out making a lot of babies. Abraham and Sarah have a son called Isaac, who goes on, it seems to become quite seriously relevant later on. And there's, I think, one of the key parts of this story that stand out is that God tells Abraham to take his son Isaac up the hill, up a big mountain, and sacrifice him, i.e. kill him. Bit odd. But Abraham goes along with this. There's a big ramble in the story about he's going up the hill, he's making his son carry the wood up there, and his son's asking, well, what are we going to sacrifice? There's nothing, all the rest of it. Awkward. Anyway, he gets up there and Abraham's just about to kill his son. When God says, no, it's fine, I'm just kidding, you don't actually have to kill him. Well done, you passed the test. Like, that's a really messed up test. But, yeah. And that's pretty much it. That's Abraham's thing was go to an area, make a lot of babies. And wasn't particularly morally upstanding in terms of how all that was done. So it's almost compelling in terms of its sounding literal, because it's so... Why would you make that up? It doesn't make any sense to go into that random detail and all the rest of it. So I'm not averse to the idea of that being literal. I guess people having kids, I think Abraham was 99, and I think it was said that Sarah was 10 years younger than him, so 89. So having kids at that age is okay, but potentially, if you could, that seems a much easier thing to try and accept, that maybe the dates are just a bit wrong or something compared to everything else we've had to deal with so far. I think overall, therefore, I'm not immediately going, no, absolutely, that clearly cannot be right. Maybe that is right to some extent. And obviously, to be entirely true, we have to accept that God tells someone to take his son up there and chop him up, and then tells him, just kidding, don't worry. So, but I mean, the story in terms of the broad strokes, I think maybe that could be all right. In terms of moral of the story, I guess this does feel like this one isn't about having a moral of the story. It feels like it's just almost narration in terms of, okay, now this happened, then that happened, and that happened. So this is part of how God moved things forward. You'd think there'd be something in the God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son and then saying, no, you don't have to bother. There's obviously a testing element in that. Whether that says good things or bad things, it feels like that doesn't say the nicest things. I mean, if someone asked me to go and sacrifice my child, they're going to get told to sod off. But yeah, interesting. That does feel like a massive shift in tone of the Bible, going from parable to potentially narration, shall we say, in terms of moving the story forward and towards some sort of objective that God has, which would seem to be getting a lot of people to a certain area. For what we'll find out.